You are such a dear." At Lent he went to Moscow to get his company together, and, while without him, Olenka was unable to sleep. She sat at the window the whole time, gazing at the stars. She likened herself to the hens that are also uneasy and unable to sleep when their rooster is out of the coop. Kukin was detained in Moscow. He wrote he would be back during Easter week, and in his letters discussed arrangements already for the Tivoli. But late one night, before Easter Monday, there was an ill-omened knocking at the wicket gate. It was like a knocking on a barrel. Boom, boom, boom. The sleepy cook ran barefooted, plashing through the puddles, to open the gate. "Open the gate, please," said someone in a hollow bass voice. "I have a telegram for you." Olenka had received telegrams from her husband before, but this time somehow she was numbed with terror. She opened the telegram with trembling hands and read: "Ivan Petrovich died suddenly today. Awaiting prompt orders for the funeral Tuesday." That was the way the telegram was written. Funeral, and another unintelligible word, propt. The telegram was signed by the manager of the opera company. "My dearest," Olenka burst out sobbing. "Vanichka, my dearest, my sweetheart! Why did I ever meet you? Why did I ever get to know you and love you? To whom have you abandoned your poor Olenka? Your poor, unhappy Olenka." Kukin was buried on Tuesday in the Vaganov cemetery in Moscow. Olenka returned home on Wednesday, and as soon as she entered her house she threw herself on her bed and broke into such loud sobbing that she could be heard in the street and in the neighboring yards. "The darling," said the neighbors, crossing themselves. "How Olga Semyonovna, the poor darling, is grieving." 3 months afterwards, Olenka was returning home from mass, downhearted and in deep mourning. Beside her walked a man also returning from church, Vasily Pustovalov, the manager of the merchant Babakayev's lumber yard. He was wearing a straw hat, a white vest with a gold chain, and looked more like a landowner than a businessman. "Everything has its ordained course, Olga Semyonovna," he said sedately, with sympathy in his voice. "And if any one near and dear to us dies, then it means it was God's will, and we should remember that and bear it with submission." He took her to the wicket gate, said good-bye, and went away. After that she heard his sedate voice the whole day, and on closing her eyes she instantly had a vision of his dark beard. She took a great liking to him, and evidently he had been impressed by her too, for not long after an elderly woman, a distant acquaintance, came in to have a cup of coffee with her, and as soon as the woman was seated at table she began to speak about Pustovalov, how good he was, what a steady man, and any woman could be glad to get him as a husband. 3 days later Pustovalov himself paid Olenka a visit. He stayed only about 10 minutes and spoke little, but Olenka fell in love with him, fell in love so desperately that she did not sleep the whole night and burned as with fever. In the morning she sent for the elderly woman. Soon after, Olenka and Pustovalov were engaged, and the wedding followed. Pustovalov and Olenka lived happily together. He usually stayed in the lumber yard until dinner, then went out on business. In his absence, Olenka took his place in the office until evening, attending to the bookkeeping and dispatching the orders. "Lumber rises 20% every year nowadays," she told her customers and acquaintances. "Imagine, we used to buy wood from our forests here. Now Vasichka has to go every year to the government of Mogilev to get wood. And what a tax!" she exclaimed, covering her cheeks with her hands in terror. "What a tax!" She felt as if she had been dealing in lumber for ever so long, that the most important and essential thing in life was lumber. There was something touching and endearing in the way she pronounced the words beam, joist, plank, stave, lath, gun carriage, clamp. At night she dreamed of whole mountains of boards and planks, long, endless rows of wagons conveying the wood somewhere far, far from the city. She dreamed that a whole regiment of beams, 36 feet by 5 inches, were advancing in an upright position to do battle against the lumber yard, that the beams and joists and clamps were knocking against each other, emitting the sharp crackling reports of dry wood, that they were all falling and then rising again, piling on top of each other. Olenka cried out in her sleep, and Pustovalov said to her gently, "Olenka, my dear, what is the matter? Cross yourself." Her husband's opinions were all hers. If he thought the room was too hot, she thought so too. If he thought business was dull, she thought business was dull. Pustovalov was not fond of amusements and stayed home on holidays. She did the same. "You are always either at home or in the office," said her friends. "Why don't you go to the theatre or to the circus, darling?" "Vasichka and I never go to the theatre," she answered sedately. "We have work to do. We have no time for nonsense. What does one get out of going to the theatre?" On Saturdays she and Pustovalov went to vespers, and on holidays to early mass. On returning home they walked side by side, with rapt faces, and agreeable smell emanating from both of them, and her silk dress rustling pleasantly. At home they drank tea with milk bread and various jams, and then ate pie. Every day at noontime there was an appetizing odor in the yard and outside the gate of cabbage soup, roast mutton or duck, and, on fast days, of fish. You couldn't pass the gate without being seized by an acute desire to eat. The samovar was always boiling on the office table, and customers were treated to tea and biscuits. Once a week the married couple went to the baths and returned with red faces, walking side by side. "We are getting along very well, thank God," said Olenka to her friends. "God grant that all should live as well as Vasichka and I." When Pustovalov went to the government of Mogilev to buy